Hello and welcome to Drop and Get the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And today we're talking about Avengers Endgame. Finally, it has arrived. 10 years after the Marvel Cinematic Universe began.
Yes.
Unsuspectingly with Iron Man, when no one knew what would result. We've got to this behemoth of a movie. 3 hours long.
Before you start, can I say how thrilling it was to be at the cinema and to have those enormous queues and... there was like a palpable excitement, and actually it was a real experience to see it with an audience.
I was very excited as well.
Oh, well, you couldn't hardly contain yourself.
Yeah, although I was thinking about why on the way to the cinema, because it's only in the last few days that I've really become excited. Once we booked the tickets, really. I mean, we had to book tickets because it's packed out.
Yes.
So I booked the tickets, and then I thought, oh, we're going to go see it. We're going to go see it, and I started to get more excited, and. I kind of realised that the reason I was getting excited was because of the game of... They've written themselves into this corner, theoretically, with Infinity War. Spoilers, I suppose, at the end of Infinity War, Thanos, the villain, manages to kill half of all life in the universe by snapping his fingers. That was what they were trying to avoid. And so you're going with Endgame, how... Well, I listened back to that first podcast that we did on it.
Oh, did you? I didn't, yes.
And God, it was hard to listen to.
Was it?
For me.
Oh.
And I advise everyone not to listen to it because I was so taken in by that ending that I just believed every second of it. And you I mean the rest of the podcast,
I remember we had an argument about that.
Well, it wasn't an argument, it was a discussion, but it wasn't an argument at all. But what I have since come to realise is that because I'm not a comic book guy.
Right. And
not being inured enough to what it does. I didn't really realise at the time that this. I'm used to soap operas. I'm used to wrestling, although I don't really watch wrestling. But I'm used to the fact that in those, nothing really counts ever. People, everything is changeable. People come back to life. You can do what you want. I'm very used to that in soap operas. Certainly, I mean, people are always coming back in EastEnders and things. And although that is clearly something that comic books do, I just wasn't in that frame of mind, so I totally believed the ending of that film, and I was like, God, something might happen, and it's really fucking hard for me to listen back to that. So I think I'm so stupid.
Everyone should listen to it.
It's horrible. There's about 5-10 minutes at the start of that podcast where it's absolutely horrible for me to listen to.
But is it horrible to listen to me?
No, you're fine.
Okay, yeah, listen, everybody.
Because you're just sitting there going, I can guarantee that everyone's going to come back, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. And I really wished I lacked the moral integrity that said I have to keep this up to stand for all time. I wish I could just go delete it and pretend it never happened.
No,
but I won't. It's good. That led me to going, why am I so excited about this though? And so part of it is that I had got used to the idea that obviously these characters are going to come back, but the question is then how, right? And I sent you a little clip of something that I noticed in Ant-Man 2, where in the post-credit scene where Ant-Man gets stuck in quantum time or quantum space, there's this thing about don't get stuck in a time vortex, and I was like, ooh, time vortex, that's going to come back, and actually it fucking didn't. Waste of time. But that was what I was getting excited about, right? I didn't really care about what would happen about the characters. I wanted to play the game of the film. It was a little bit like Inception, I think.
Yeah.
That first half of this film is going, how is the story going to progress logically, and how are they going to do this, that, and the other?
Yes.
And there's a kind of game that you play as an audience member along with that.
Yes.
Did you enjoy that?
I loved it. Actually, I really, so we've been seeing quite a lot of films this week, I guess, and there are some that I've really loved, but even when I've loved them, there's always this moment where you look at your watch. And actually, this is 3 hours and 20 minutes long?
No, just 3 hours.
3 hours. I didn't look at my watch once.
No, I agree.
So it's it really...
It's amazing how well it makes use of its time, in a way.
Yeah, it's fantastic, actually. You're riveted throughout. There were these, well, I'm going to say kids, except they were all kind of, I'm sure in their mid-20s or probably 30s and, gigantic, really. And...
compared to you.
Well, compared to me, yes. And they were like completely glued to the screen. I mean, you know, they would like their heads would move forward, right? Kind of that's
the two lads sitting next to you. I noticed.
Yeah, how rapt and attentive he was, really. And then, of course, at one point they all started crying as well. So you know, a film that can grab your attention like that and be exciting and you know and be so visually interesting, and then kind of and make people laugh and cry.
It got very good reactions from the audience. There were these moments where. This is going to be full of spoilers, obviously, so you know you need to have seen Endgame to listen to this. Moments like when Captain America earns Mjolnir, the Thor's hammer. There was this because it was a fantastic moment. You know, the whole thing was that he is worthy to wield it.
Yes.
And Thor realizes that, and it's not Thor who chooses; it's the hammer that chooses. You know, because there was this thing in the second Avengers movie, The Age of Ultron, where they're all drinking and they all go, "Let's try and pick up Thor's hammer," and none of them can. But there's this moment in it, this little joke is all it was at the time, where as Captain America tries to pick it up, it moves just a tiny bit, and Thor looks really worried. You know, you never thought. Well, I never thought that would come back and pay off, and it becomes his weapon in this. It's kind of amazing. And this and it's because of the significance of what it means for the character, and that he's earned it, and that he's so morally good that he can wield this thing, and the audience went crazy for that. You know, like the gasps. And kind of ahs and oohs around the audience. When Spider-Man is returned towards the end of the film, they finally bring back all the characters that they have been resurrected early in the film, but they only show up at the end. And he's just his normal self, and he's yakking away, and Iron Man just hugs him. You know, you hear people in the audience going, "Oh,
I know." There were so many moments like that. Yes, I mean, for me, there's a fantastic acting moment actually. Which is where Scarlett Johansson goes to find Jeremy Renner, who's kind of...
He's chopping people up in China.
Chopping people up or Japan.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, probably Japan,
and he turns around to look at her, and he does this thing by tilting his face, almost kind of ashamed for her to have caught him... You know,
he's behaving.
To see what he's been reduced.
He's been wreaking vengeance on the world basically because he's lost his family and he's just full of anger. He's taking it out on everyone and killing huge amounts of people.
Yeah, but he gives her this amazing look, which is one that's full of like kind of love for her, but also regret and a bit of shame at what he's become. And I just thought, you know, Jeremy Renner was so great. I mean, to me that was almost like the acting moment in the film, actually. You know, it was just like a tilt of the head and a glance. It was very moving.
There are some really good... It's obviously a fantastic cast and everybody's in it, and they get some very good performances out of their actors. I think Robert Downey Jr. is great throughout, and particularly at the start when the film opens on the same kind of very solemn, morose tone that the previous film ended on. You start off 23 days or so after Thanos has done the snap, and Tony Stark is about to die, and he's returned to Earth by Captain Marvel.
Yes.
And he's thin. I mean, he's basically been starving on this ship. I mean, he looks visually he's something to look at.
Yeah.
And he doesn't want any part of this like new plan to try and go and get Thanos and reverse the blah blah blah. And he's shaking, and like he doesn't really have full control of his muscles, you know, like he can't keep his head straight and that sort of thing.
That moment is great.
A wonderful physical performance in that scene.
Yes.
And you just feel the kind of breakup and the failure, his sense of failure.
Yes. I don't share your enthusiasm for him in the rest of the scenes. I mean, but you know, that's now just part of the way. I used to love him, but at a certain point I just thought he got too facile and rather smug, and you know, and I suppose maybe that's the character he's also playing. The moment you're describing is genuinely moving, you know, so...
Do you think there's an element of that this film is redressing, though? I mean, that morose tone, although that is where it is at its strongest at the start, it kind of continues throughout the film. It has this elegiac tone to it, if you like. And he, as someone who is kind of regretful, but he has this interesting thing about his character where he has been able to keep a family because he didn't die and Pepper Potts didn't die, and they have a daughter together who didn't die. And when they come to him for help 5 years on, saying, we reckon that we can do this time travel, and fix it, he turns them down because he's like, I can't lose anything else. He's not acting cocky at this point at all, kind of smug or arrogant. He's really vulnerable.
Yes. Yeah, like I said, it might be a personal thing, but I just, I've ended up not liking him. But those, particularly the first moment where he's very thin and so on, he's very, very good. I hate the sight of Gwyneth Paltrow, and actually, I don't think she's good in anything, really. But, every time she appeared in this film, it jarred me a little bit out of it, actually. I just think she's not very good. Really.
She got laughs in this when she's dressed up in a suit at the end with everybody else taking part in the fight.
Yes.
And I didn't laugh, but I agreed with everyone who laughed.
Yes. But those are minor points, in a film that I think, I just loved kind of seeing it with this audience. And actually there was also something about, we saw it in IMAX and 3D, and there were a couple of moments where people were just going to the toilet, I imagine. And, they were like so tiny in comparison to the screen. So you were seeing them through your 3D glasses as kind of like a little dot on the corner of the screen. And actually that was also thrilling,
Well, I think that kind of points to actually what the film visually is best at, because I'm interested when you said right at the start that this was visually interesting.
Yes.
Because I don't agree. I think what it is visually best at is scale. Actually, rather like the previous movie, and they're both directed by the Russo brothers, who've directed a few of the other Marvel films. Because what this film does is scale. It makes things big and imposing, and it gives you a sense of the task at hand, if you like. Kind of the odds being stacked against these characters, and it does so visually as well as through the storytelling, through the plot and the writing. And I think that kind of that what you're talking about the screen being so huge and these people being so tiny, is in addition to that. I felt the same way when I saw those people leaving and coming back.
I suppose what I mean specifically about it being visually interesting is that it does feel like a comic book come alive with all of the panels and all that sensitivity to paneling and scale in the paneling and movement. I remember the scene where they're gearing up to the final battle with Thanos, and Ant-Man appears, and he's now huge, right? And he's occupying one side of the screen, and then the camera kind of allows you to see it just like a comic book panel. And I thought, this is so great, so kind of that's what I mean.
Yeah, well, I think that kind of talks to what I'm suggesting is the film's visual sort of core, is that it's about scale. That is something that's about scale and about how imposing he is. So he's so huge. It's in slow motion. Well, when he breaks out of being underground, he's giant, and the slow motion sells it.
Yes, but I think there's also something about the composition, because you are framing all of these people, this huge array of superheroes, within kind of a frame. So, I don't
disagree with you on that.
I take my hat off to that. Actually, I thought that was very good.
But I think that the Russos, and this is again something that I see in the previous Marvel work, it's mechanical, kind of. So one thing that I think was really great about the last film, and I would say about this, is that there's not an ounce of fat on it. We both watched Infinity War recently as well, in the preparation of this, independently, and that's 2.5 hours long itself.
Yes.
And with the exception for me of the scene early on in like Glasgow or Edinburgh in Infinity War, which I think you could lose or cut down, there's not really an ounce of fat. Like everything moves and everything kind of feels, as you say, you don't check your watch or anything like that. But there is also something that is just mechanical. It's about getting the plot out. And I think as visual storytelling goes, I don't think there's anything that strong or beautiful imagery. Is there anything beautiful in these?
Chris Evans' eyelashes. I mean, my God, they were so beautiful and so long. Kind of, they were longer than Scarlett Johansson's. I mean, no, but I do think that the film has a theme that is really well worked out and that is very consistent throughout. It's a theme about second chances. The whole film is about second chances, right? And kind of, so all of the heroes getting a second chance to save the world, right? But also Thor, getting a second chance to turn his life around, and Ant-Man the same, and Captain America, to be reunited with his love. Like there's this whole thing about
this whole section as well about people visiting their past.
Yeah. So and I think it's quite consistent, and it builds incredibly well on all of the other Marvel films that you've seen. Yeah. So if you're talking also about kind of things that are used kind of symbolically, well, there's a whole bunch of them really. I mean, the shield, right? And kind of to me, these are not necessarily the best aspects of the film, right? But, kind of the shield that gets brought up by Iron Man, handed over to Captain America, and at the end it gets kind of handed over once again. So hopefully we're going to have a black kind of Captain America, right? But those things are kind of consistently used throughout,
Yeah.
And they develop. I mean, also the thing about the hammer that you mentioned, the stuff about the time machine. Yeah, I thought all of that was kind of interesting and consistent. But really, for me, the most important thing was that the film creates people, right, and kind of people with unresolved issues and kind of yearnings. Really, and it does so. It's a multiple task, so it's kind of quite a lot of things to kind of juggle in the air at the same time, and to kind of give them, a rationale and a context and purpose and meaning. So I think the film is amazing at doing that. It's very difficult to do.
Yeah, and I think it's more successful, or not more successful, but it's better in that sense than the previous film because the story is more complex. And actually, you watch this one and you go, I think it kind of reveals in a way how simple Infinity War was. Which is not to say that that's a bad thing on the part of Infinity War, but that was a very simple story. Although it split off into a number of strands, it was just all about Thanos is coming.
Yes.
It's like Thanos is coming, in whatever way we have to try and stop him. And it's just this 2.5 hour thing of trying to stop him. And this film splits into different strands in a way. So it starts off with a very, very long opening movement of this kind of coping with what the world has become, and the various and that they're keeping a kind of skeleton Avengers alive with the people they have left that Scarlett Johansson's now in charge of, and it's when Ant-Man comes back by chance that this new plan kind of emerges. You feel like up till then they're just going to have to live with this,
Yeah.
And then the film turns into the quite good fun kind of romping through time to get the stones back, and then once they got the stones back, a whole other thing starts because Thanos has now found out blah blah blah, and so it's a number of films in one in a way. It's like one after the other.
Actually, just to keep on that idea, one of the things that I thought was so amazing about the film was how it managed and orchestrated and narrativized the various tonalities, so. So you mentioned, for example, the elegiac kind of element at the beginning, but then as soon as the gang from the galaxy,
Guardians of the Galaxy, Chris Pratt hardly shows up.
Yeah, but when those people come up, the film has a completely different tone.
For sure, yeah.
When Thor comes up, the film turns into like a comedy, right? So and then when the people are placed together, the tones are managed, so it doesn't feel like any one element is out of place. Yeah, so yes. I thought that's kind of amazing.
It's incredibly coherent.
Yeah.
In that sense.
So each of those things has a different tone, but they're kind of orchestrated together incredibly well.
For me, one of the strongest things about the film was it's interesting that as we've mentioned this elegiac tone, and I think it's the right word to use, and I think it's a film that it's about. At the start, it's about mourning, but it's kind of throughout sort of about mourning itself as much as it is about mourning.
Oh, completely.
Death. Like it's going. Oh, it's the end of our story.
It's the end of Chris Evans as Captain America and Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man.
Exactly, because it's not the end of the story, but it is the end of this.
Bye, Gwyneth.
It's the end of this movement of movies for 10 years, and it's a really good thing that you didn't stay for the credits because I stuck out they have that animated part of the credits before they go into just the list. And in the animated part of the credits, I mean, when they show up on YouTube, whatever, you've got to have a look because God Almighty, it's everyone gets like a bit of a moment, but they do every fucking character, like all the minor characters that you don't care about. They all get their name and they get a bit of, and it's romantic music. Oh, these people, oh, we miss you. Like like the in memoriam segment from the Oscars. Where it's like, and then when the principal characters come up, the main Avengers. Not only do they each get their own several seconds of here's your name, but they trace out the actor's autograph on screen before the kind of printed name comes up. Like they're signing their characters.
Yeah.
Oh, I miss you. Oh.
Well, to be honest,
horrible. You would have hated that.
Yes, I would. And I hope they retire Iron Man for a bit, actually. I hope they're wise about it and kind of don't bring him back immediately. And the same, Captain America, you already know he's got a successor, but hopefully, because of who has been chosen to succeed, it'll be like a different kind of film, hopefully. So i.e., the Chris Evans Captain Americans hopefully will be one thing, and the people who like them can continue to cherish them, but, it's not as if somebody's taking over the same character.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So I think all of that is very wise.
It's like kind of it. You remember what they did with Star Trek when they brought back Star Trek for these new movies, and in that first, which I think was a really clever way they did it in that first film, where they split into this different timeline, and the way they really established it was they had two versions of Spock. Yeah. They had Leonard Nimoy, and then they had Zachary Quinto, and they interact in one scene at the end, and that whole film is going, we're not ruining Star Trek for you. The Star Trek that you know and love exists, and it's there forever. We're just inviting you to a new universe. And so this isn't doing that. This is continuing the same timeline, but that way, the way in which it is literally Captain America, Chris Evans passing his shield to Anthony Mackie. Is achieving, I think, the same sort of thing.
Yes. Not to shit on the film, but one of the things that the kids next to me were saying, do you reckon that this is really the best film of all time? Because obviously they've, that's been bandied around about this film. And to be honest, not only do I not think it's not the best film of all time, I don't even think it's a great film.
No, and it's not the best Marvel film either.
What would you choose?
Black Panther's superior,
for sure.
Really.
Yeah, okay.
Amongst others, but this is I can't remember what, I think Mark Kermode, when he talks about Avatar, said it's like watching an oil tanker turn round. It's incredibly impressive to look at, and you have this enormous sense of the weight of what's going on and the danger if it goes wrong, but it's not art.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be my thing. I mean, if kind of you think, well, it's about second chances, but what it has to say about them is not very interesting. It's all like, kind of, they've all read the same self-help book. So, it's no Ozu, which is kind of my benchmark.
Have people really been saying, is this the best film of all time, or is it just them?
It could just be them. I mean, I haven't read any of the reviews, so I don't know. I mean, we did read the New Yorker piece on, the Marvel Universe, just because I thought, we ought to before we do our podcast. And I thought actually that was very, very good. And very interesting, making distinctions between kind of, recurrence and soap operas and, things like The Simpsons and why this is different,
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting. But just because it does it well, and, I don't want to sneer, because to make people laugh and to make people cry and to keep people excited for 3 hours is quite an amazing achievement. But I would agree with you that it's not art. It kind of, it reminds me of like one of those 1930s films that were like very spectacular, like San Francisco, where there was an earthquake in the middle of it and so on. Or even something like Gone with the Wind, really, that is in its own way, well, I mean, now it's difficult to watch because of, the racial stereotypes and so on. But, kind of narratively, it kind of, it really engrossed several generations anyway, but it's the same thing, right? It's kind of, it's engrossing, it's got great performances, it's very spectacular, but it's not art,
it's funny that you should mention Gone with the Wind and racial stereotypes in particular, because it's something that was on my mind slightly in this, is how kind of white this film is in a way, and I don't mean that to say I'm just identifying that it's. What I mean is that Marvel has developed in the last few years. It's fine. People have pointed out that it's finally been expanding into. We finally made a film with black people. Yeah. We finally made a film with a woman as a hero. Yeah. Which they've done with Black Panther and Captain Marvel recently. And every film up until then, has been a white guy. Yes. In the hero role, basically.
And not to piss them off, but old white guys at that.
Well, they are now, certainly.
Yes. And, they didn't start off young. I mean, Robert Downey Jr., must have been in his late 30s by the time he got that role. So, they're no spring chickens.
Yeah. And if there is a sense in which, like, you can't change the past, as much as this film sort of talks about going back to the past, you can't change what happened and what the film's kind of used to be like. But if there is a sense in which this film puts an end to a certain cycle, yes, of Marvel films, although they will continue, it would be nice to think that cycle of them all being so homogenous,
so white, so Aryan in many ways.
Exactly. Actually. Yeah. Well, I think you possibly overuse the word Aryan sometimes.
But I don't think so. I mean, look at Chris Evans is like blue-eyed, tall. Look at Chris Hemsworth, like, my God, right? Like, what's the guy who plays Ant-Man?
Paul Rudd.
Paul Rudd, the same. Well, the same. Yeah, he's an English. He's English originally.
Paul Rudd, he's American.
He was born in England. His family emigrated to the U.S.
Is that true?
Yes, it is. Okay. And he's got that same kind of fair, light-eyed thing. It's a recurring pattern in the films. They're all kind of.
I mean, he has got dark hair. he's not
well, but
Asgardian.
Well, but that's a kind of having dark hair.
Well, what I mean is
still fair.
What I mean is that the word Aryan says something quite specific.
Well, to me, it's kind of a Northern European kind of look. He was
born
I don't
in
know
New
the
Jersey,
exact definition. Huh?
Paul Rudd was born in New Jersey.
Well,
in America.
Well, his family's English, okay. So I'm pretty sure of that actually, because he's spoken about it in interviews.
Yes, his parents were born in England. It says.
Right. So, and he was raised here partly. So,
I'm not. I'm going to close his Wikipedia page.
Okay, fine.
But
my point stands. Brie Larson. I mean, the name alone is Swedish or something like that. Swedish origin. Gwyneth Paltrow. Like this tall, gigantic blonde. I mean, it's got a look, and it's a problem. Because the U.S. is kind of black and Hispanic and many things. So actually, to make the whole Marvel universe until
Black Panther.
Yeah.
I agree, and this is what I'm saying, although in a slightly less severe way. Perhaps. Well, what I'm saying is that my point ultimately, if we agree to differ slightly on the particular terminology.
Okay, so Northern European.
What I'm saying is that if this film represents an end to that certain cycle, then it would be nice to think that the next part of it is going to be far more diverse in terms of representations.
Well, I hope so. The film is making gestures to it. So, the passing on of the Captain American shield. And
it has that moment where all the female heroes get together and have their moments in the battle.
Yeah. And of course, kind of Black Panther is given, quite an important role at the end as well, right?
Although I did note that the army that is provided by Wakanda to fight the army of invading aliens,
yes,
it has this tone of they're all black and just being used as
cannon fodder,
sort of.
Yeah, no, I those things remain, and actually, I think even the passing on of the shield of Captain America feels like overly symbolic and forced, and so. But just to keep, Scarlett Johansson, again, it really is Benedict Cumberbatch. Like, it is a very kind of, white Northern European kind of,
Okay.
And it's a problem. So I'm glad they do seem to be trying to kind of take measures to kind of make that more inclusive. After all, if they can put a fucking tree and a raccoon in it, they can find kind of people of color, right? Like,
Yeah.
So, which, I think it is kind of a condemnation to that they haven't kind of done this earlier. I mean, there was that whole question, can Spider-Man be black and stuff like that? I mean, ridiculous, right? Of course he can. I mean...
Actually, when we talked about that Spider-Man animated film, Into the Spider-Verse, it was something that we kind of took for granted, really. Yes. We didn't really mention the fact that he's half African-American, half Hispanic in that film. That's the Miles Morales, that's the version. Yeah. And we kind of just took that for granted, like, yeah, that's just what he is in this. But like, that's kind of huge, actually. Yes. Like, there is something very meaningful about that.
Yes, there is, actually.
That we didn't make enough of at the time. And these films are important, and these films constantly make $1.5 to $2 billion or more. This film's going to break box office.
And they play worldwide.
No doubt.
So, I mean, I think...
and you're not just in the business of making money, you're in the business of culture.
Yes.
And you have a cultural responsibility.
That's
basically,
right.
If you're making movies, especially if you're making movies this huge.
Yes. I mean, so there was that Asian woman from what is it, Galaxy Quest? Galaxy Quest is the film? The
with the antennas.
With the antennas.
Galaxy Quest, Guardians of the Galaxy.
Guardians of the Galaxy.
Right, yeah.
But actually, it's still significant, that the only Japanese or Chinese or Korean person that you see in the film are still ninjas, right? There's no Hispanics at all, so, and what, like 1% of the people, or 5% maybe, are around Black Panther, right? Like, there's not that many black characters either. So, I think it is worth commenting on. I mean, I don't want to... I don't want to...
And actually, one of those characters that was kind of controversial before was Tilda Swinton's character from Doctor Strange, who, because that was originally an Asian character, so there were accusations of cultural whitewashing when Tilda Swinton took the role, which I didn't particularly care about. But part of the reason was that I loved Tilda... I didn't know anything about the comic, for one thing, but also that I loved Tilda Swinton in Doctor Strange, and I was really glad to see her back here.
Yes.
And really, she has just this one scene where she... just has a presence,
she's
and
fantastic.
A tone, and she's wonderful.
So, and actually, that wouldn't be an issue if there were Asian characters elsewhere in the film. But they're not actually.
Well, it's just Benedict Wong who plays one of the like Doctor Strange's second in command type.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, we are totally in agreement on this.
Yeah,
basically.
we are.
There's one thing I've made a few notes, obviously.
Okay.
There's one other thing I wanted to say about the kind of the overarching story and the way this kind of film sort of ends a movement of films, which is that there's been this ongoing story since the first Avengers film, really. Avengers Assemble, it was called in this country. This ongoing conflict of a sort between Iron Man and Captain America, and it's kind of it's always seemed like a fight for control of the group.
Yes.
Kind of, and then it became quite explicit in in Civil War, which was ostensibly a Captain America film. It was Captain America Civil War, but it involved absolutely everybody. It was huge, and it was about their giant philosophical difference about which way the Avengers should go.
Yes.
And it's referenced again here. And part of the story of this film is about the two of them being able to work together again and kind of getting over their trust issues with each other and their differences. And there's not only is that dealt with in the story, as I say, but it's also dealt with in a kind of meta fictional sense. It's like it's because there's a kind of fight for control of the films in a way. Like whose films are these overall? Are they Robert Downey Jr.'s or are they Chris Evans's? Because it was funny to me that in the kind of promotional run up to all of this, people talking about the end of it, and the actors kind of on Instagram are talking about like, oh, it's the end of my time with all my friends and stuff. It seemed to be Chris Evans who was getting all of the kind of attention, weirdly.
Well, I'm not surprised, but
I don't particularly follow Instagram or anything, but that's just this kind of sense I got of like it's Chris Evans leaving that was the big deal kind of to people, which surprised me because these films started off with Iron Man, and I kind of always thought of them as Iron Man's films.
Well, I don't. I mean, just because they started off with Iron Man, and there is like this whole nostalgia for Iron Man. But the Iron Man films didn't do anywhere near the money that the Black Panther or the Avengers films have done.
Well, they said. I mean, they as the films got more and more popular and more involved, they, I think, just went on to make more and more money. I think had the film started off with Captain America, you would have probably found the same trend with Iron Man coming in.
Well, that's true.
I don't think.
I mean, I've never gotten. I mean, everybody likes Robert Downey Jr., but I don't think he's beloved, as a star.
I think he was when Iron Man was in the kind of the first 5 years of I think at that point it really seemed like it was just Iron Man's team.
Right.
Like the Avengers would all hang around Stark Tower, and that's where they would meet up. And he got all the technology and stuff, and he seemed to be the one kind of in charge. Well, and I think it's as the films have developed, Captain America seems to have taken on more of a. I think that kind of happened in the Civil War film, where he kind of took a stand and said, we're splitting up here.
Yes.
Well,
anyway, I'm actually glad that they're both out of the picture. I think it'll open up creative opportunities for Marvel. Yes.
I think the fun thing I want to get to about it though is the way that this film ends up kind of dealing with it is, I think it's something I really picked up on. I think it's kind of interesting because, although it's a team effort, what's going on in these films, saving the world and everything, people have their moments, and there's one particular thing where they argue about who's going to make the snap when they've gathered the stones for themselves and can try and put everything right. Who's going to make the snap? Because only one person can wield the glove. And actually, at that point in the film, it's the Hulk, which has another thing going on. But when it finally happens right at the end, that moment is given to Iron Man.
Yes.
And he's the one who's given the moment of sacrificing himself, killing himself by doing the snap, because it's such a powerful surge of energy, it kills him. Sacrificing himself to save the world. And then he's given this funeral that's so overdone, as if he's the first.
That lasts too long.
As if he's the first person to ever die in one of these films.
Yes.
Although in a way he kind of is, because like a lot of other people have died, but the main heroes have all been all right. So it has this weird.
We don't know about Scarlett Johansson though. I'm hopeful. There's a hint that she'll be back.
I don't know.
Yes, because when the Hulk put the glove on, he said the first thing I wanted was for her to return.
Yeah, he said it. What he said was, I tried to make her return and he couldn't.
No, well, we don't know whether.
Because they make the point that they're gone. Because not Nebula, Gamora is the same thing. Chris Pratt wants her back. There's so many fucking Chris's. Chris Pratt wants her back, and right at the end, he's looking for where he can find her. So there's this thing of they want them back, and as you say, obviously anyone can come back to life when they want. So,
I think Scarlett Johansson will be back.
But the other part of it is, so you get that funeral scene with Tony Stark and how everyone is going to miss him. But the very end of the film is given to Chris Evans.
Okay, yes.
He having gone into the past to put all the stones back, decides to stay. This really lovely thing where they meet him again as an old man. He's waiting for them, and he says, "I'm not going to tell you what happened, but we as the audience get to see," and we get to see in the 1950s him in a house with
his wife.
Well, actually, probably the 40s. A house with his wife dancing,
yes.
And it's just close up of the two of their faces, and they kiss, and so the emotional kind of core and end of the film is given to him. And as I say, I never cared about any of the characters really. I never cared about their emotional lives, but that was a very, very nice moment.
That was a very nice moment. Actually, the film is full of them. I thought the moment between Hawkeye and Black Widow, when they're each struggling over who will sacrifice their life, was very touching.
Yeah, so that's the scene where they have to get the Soul Stone, and as has been established in the previous film, they have to sacrifice something they love. And what the film is doing is saying they love each other.
Yeah.
And not only do they love each other, they love each other so much that they want to be the ones to sacrifice themselves.
Yes.
As opposed to forcing the other person to die.
Yes.
And I think that scene really struck me as a case of show, don't tell. Because while they were talking it over, I didn't believe that they loved each other. Really. I kind of knew they were supposed to, but I didn't believe it. And then it's only once, basically, actions speak louder than words. It's only once they start fighting over it, he kind of throws her to the ground, and then she stuns him, and then he shoots her in the leg, and constantly one-upping each other to try and be the one to sacrifice themselves. That's when I believed it.
Yes, it's very beautifully done. Because kind of, the emotion is carried through the action, and that's an action sequence, right? So I thought that was lovely. I mean, the film is really kind of
wonderful. Quite novel, that scene.
Yeah.
And it's really, really well executed.
I also admired all the world building, because actually you're traveling through different worlds. So, in some you're on space, in some you're in Thanos' world, in some you are in an Earth that's been despoiled of half of its population and deserted and so on. In others you are in, contemporary New York. Narratively, the film goes through 2012, 2014, 2015, right? And kind of you don't feel that you're lost at any moment, really, So I think that's quite amazing. And it's an amazing achievement.
Yeah, but I think that all that part of it has that kind of mechanical aspect of, like, they're very good at establishing things and keeping you aware of exactly where you are and what's going on, but feels like I need more.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I mean, kind of. So people were touched, but it felt kind of a bit manipulative, actually. And it certainly didn't illuminate, what it is to be human, or what the world is like, or, I was moved by it, but it didn't touch me very deeply.
I think what you were saying about this feeling like the most comic booky of the films, in a sense, is what I felt too. And what I mean by that is that, having kind of since Infinity War got used to the idea that of course these things are comic books on screen. Of course there's impermanence and everything that's going on and all this stuff. This had a feeling of, in a sense, a kind of lightness and a sort of freedom. And I think it was best expressed around that section where they travel back in time to various times. They go back to the various movies, and this is something that I talked to my brother about, saying, I think he might have mentioned it to me. I reckon they're going to go back to the old movies, and I was thinking, like, there's a D12 song called My Band, and part of that is the rapper Bizarre saying, I was in all of Eminem's old videos in the back, and then the music video shows you him just hanging out in the back of these music videos. I thought, oh god, it'd be great if it's like that, and actually it is kind of like that. And the film has a kind of a freedom of, like, as soon as they basically say, let's do time travel, let's build a time machine, the film has a kind of sense of awareness of the absurdity of saying that.
Yes.
But it goes with it, right? And so once it goes with it, I kind of went with it, and so that kind of silliness, that sense of absurdity, despite the fact it's trying to build a really serious thing about getting our old friends back and everything, it's also quite absurd.
Yes.
And I think what you were saying, it balances those tones.
And it's very self-knowing as well. There's that whole discussion of everything you've ever heard about time travel is wrong, and it kind of particularly disses the Back to the Future films.
Back to the Future
film in a
and
very,
Terminator 2.
Yes, in quite a very funny and witty way. But it destroys the logic of Marvel as well, because one of the things I remember reading, as a kid who grew up reading Marvel comics, is, every time you change the past, it has repercussions. One of the things that you must never do is, like, find your other self in the past, and you certainly cannot touch it, and it breaks all the rules. Yeah.
Well, what it establishes in that scene is in that scene where they talk about previous time travel movies, and then the whole point is going, do you think time travel works like it does in the movies? And of course, like, this is a fucking movie. And as I said to you later on, like, there's a scene where Tilda Swinton shows up. Yeah. They literally have a timeline which splits off. And I said, this is Back to the Future 2. They draw that same diagram in Back to the Future 2. So not only is this like the movies, it's like one very specific movie.
Yes.
But that kind of notwithstanding, what this film establishes with its version of time travel is everything that has happened has happened. You have the Hulk saying out loud, it doesn't work like going back and changing stuff. The stuff that's happened in your past has happened.
Yes.
So you will go back to somewhere else and change it. That's what it establishes.
Yes.
And again, I think it's doing that same thing that I said, the Star Trek thing of going, the past has happened. You don't have to feel like we're throwing away the previous films. that all counts.
Yes.
Even as they do something quite interesting, which is they say when you bring everybody back, they say to the Hulk when he's trying the glove, when you bring everybody back, bring them back in with the 5 years in between.
Yes.
Don't reset it to what happened to before Infinity War. Basically, they're saying leave the gap. That's kind of interesting. Why would they particularly say that? It can only be for the audience, really, and to preserve the overarching story for the audience's sake. So the audience doesn't have to feel like they've lost something.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
That is interesting.
Can I say one or two more things?
Okay.
I think Captain Marvel is a complete waste of time, and actually.
Oh, I don't agree.
And actually, kind of a bait and switch in this.
No, I don't agree. I loved her, and actually, what I particularly loved about her is that she's sporting a new butch look. Yeah, so I think that's also a nod to something. So, she basically saves everybody's ass. And I think that's a way of kind of making women count more in this universe. I think that's very deliberate and very thought through,
I think the bait and switch is that there was that teaser at the end of Infinity War where just before he dissolves, Nick Fury manages to get his text off to her. And you see that pager in the Captain Marvel movie that you go, so she's going to be the save the day thing.
Yes.
And actually what she does is save Iron Man right at the start. And then what she do really, she shows up again later on, but she destroys. She just participates in the fight.
No, she destroys all of Thanos' spaceships.
Yeah, she flies through the big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a big deal. It is.
It doesn't feel big enough.
Well,
I felt like that was going. She's going to be the key to this. She's not the key. She's a part of it.
Yeah, well, she's an important part of it. I mean, you could say the same thing about Black Panther. So
No, I couldn't because of what was being set up. I think in Infinity War.
I don't think
she's going to be the difference here.
Well, I think she was the difference. So I think everybody's given their moment, and I think her moment is an important one.
Well, I agree with what you say about her look, and that's that moment that we mentioned where the female heroes all get together in the battlefield, and they get just their kind of moment of assembling on their own. I wonder what you made of that, because we've been talking.
It felt tokenistic.
And we've been talking about one or two things like that in previous podcasts recently. Yeah. These nods to or not nods, but sort of efforts to point out diversity or certain type of character and that sort of thing, and that had a shade of it here.
Yeah, I mean,
but
if the film was kind of really aiming to represent women better, it would have given them 50% of the action and 50% of the drama, where really, kind of they get maybe 10% or something
Well, there's the Nebula character who has a significant role.
Okay, the Nebula character who's got a significant role.
But
Scarlett Johansson has 2 scenes, really. So I mean, it feels tokenistic because on the one hand, the film is telling you, look at all these strong women and aren't they great and whatever, and then 5 seconds later, cut and you're just seeing mainly men thrashing each other around.
Yeah.
So
it's like that moment in the film kind of pointed out. It's like International Women's Day, right? And whenever International Women's Day happens, then men go, well, what about International Men's Day?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, every day is International Men's Day.
That's right.
And in this film, every day is International Men Fighting Day.
Yeah.
And there's just one moment where it's International Women Fighting Day.
Yeah, exactly.
It points out how masculine the rest of it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and what was your other point?
I kind of just this is I suppose in the context of everything else not that important, but I think this film makes Thanos make less sense, and actually it points out what a crap villain he was in a sense in the first film, that he's just like when you think about what's going to be the giant thing that they finally have to face at the end of all this, and it's just a big dude.
Oh, I don't think so.
And then in this, they kill him right at the start, but then an alternate universe version of him.
They kill him. They have to kill him again.
From 2014, finds his way into the future with evil.
I
Nebula.
love him.
And his motivation, that alternate version, makes less sense than it did in the first film because, the thing is less clear.
Well, he's given less narrative weight because you have to juggle him amidst every other superhero in the Marvel comic universe. But I thought Josh Brolin was absolutely great. in playing the part. He doesn't have the same drama of sacrificing his daughter and choosing between the daughters and all this stuff that he's given in the previous film. But that's not the fault of the character. And actually, you bring all of that information to your understanding of this particular film. So I loved him.
Fair enough. I think this film, certainly the first half of it, before just the fight begins with Thanos towards the end, when they're going back and putting everything together and trying to get the stones, it had the feeling of like a DVD extra in a way, and I don't mean that in a negative way. Like, I really liked it. I liked the way it was kind of going behind the scenes. So, for instance, you see the Avengers giant fight with the alien Chitauri, I think, in 2012 in the Avengers film. And then you see the aftermath, the cleanup crew,
yes,
and how they work for Hydra secretly, and so that's how they're going to get the stones, because they've got control of the Mind Stone in the scepter and blah blah blah. Like, it had this feeling of sort of like in Austin Powers when they go, no one thinks about the family of a henchman, and they go like the henchman's wife and child at home who are sad that he's dead. Had that kind of feeling of like behind the scenes, and it kind of didn't feel like a movie at that point. It felt like I don't know. It like I said, like a DVD extra. It was weird and kind of fun. Kind of novel. I enjoyed that, and actually, that was when the film was at its kind of most interesting, most exciting, and most original for me.
Oh, I don't know.
And I do wish that when they'd gone back in time and you revisited those old movies, they'd done more with the characters' versions of their old selves. And what I mean is that you kind of see them. There's one moment I'm thinking of in particular where you see the Hulk in the Avengers fight in 2012.
Yes.
And you see the new Hulk, who's this kind of combination of Bruce Banner and the Hulk,
love the new Hulk,
which I think is kind of novel.
And actually, Ruffalo's the exception to my everybody else is kind of an argument.
So what happens is the new Hulk sees the old Hulk, who is just hulking out the way he classically does, and is kind of ashamed of like what he used to be like. But if we're talking about this theme of you talk about second chances, and I think the theme is kind of more general in that it's about our pasts, and because it's literally about revisiting the past.
Yes.
And when he sees his old self, there's this conflict between who he was and who he is now, and I kind of think more could have been done with that, with other characters as well.
Well, that is Thor's storyline.
Yeah.
So
I wish there'd been more. I would like to have seen what the world is like. It feels a shame that it has to go into fights all the time. I kind of want to see just how these characters are getting on. And,
yes, I like the fights.
The best parts of these films are always when the characters are talking.
I think certainly kind of all the comic bits and all the bits that were moving definitely were, with the characters talking. But I think the spectacle and the action, I really enjoyed it. And it, again, very difficult to do with so much going on and so many characters and so many villains and so many spaceships. I think it was really beautifully done.
Well, it's a very efficient, well-oiled machine of a movie.
Okay, I thought it was a little bit better.
Is that too? You think I'm being too uncharitable?
I think it's an amazing achievement. I think it was a hugely enjoyable film. I'm sure I'm going to watch it again every time it pops up on television. I still think it's not art. It's kind of, it's a hugely enjoyable movie. It's no more than that.
It's a cultural product.
Yes, it is.
As opposed to art. I think, and as I say, I think if it kind of closes a chapter and opens a new one in interesting ways, then it'll be interesting to see what comes next. And obviously, I think we will continue to see these films.
Yeah, it was great fun to watch. And as I said, I take my hat off to it. I mean, a film that makes you laugh and cry is a huge achievement.
You didn't cry, though.
No, I didn't.
No. It made some idiots cry.
You said it, not me.
And I meant
it. All right. Well, on that note, I think we should stop, yeah?
Yeah.
So, thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. And on social media, we're on Twitter and Facebook. And the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Okay, so it's 3 days after we saw Avengers Endgame. We haven't seen it again, but I'm round at yours because we're seeing a Stuart Lee thing later, this rock thing at the Electric. And we've decided let's let's have a catch-up. Let's see if we've thought about it any more. You've reread a New York Times article that you've found interesting.
I read a New York Times roundtable of the New York Times critics, so Scott and Manola Dargis and the others, in which they basically discussed the film. And then kind of once I read it, I thought, oh, how dumb of me, really, because, like there are some of the things that they mentioned were things that had been going in, that I'd been thinking about for a while, and often about kind of things other than the Avengers films. And then I could just kick myself for not having brought it up,
There are also a couple of things that were on my mind as well. The film primarily has not really been on my mind, which I think you might consider an underachievement of it, considering it's supposed to be the culmination of 25 films or something.
Well, we left the podcast saying, it's a really fun film, it's really entertaining, but it's not art. And actually, it's demonstrably true in the sense that there was nothing in it that lingered in your mind, that kind of, that you wanted to explore or that resonated. So really, kind of, for me, it's more a question of, these are things that I wanted, or I wish I would have said, in the podcast immediately after we saw it, and that, have percolated a few days later.
Exactly.
But it's not because the film has been playing in your mind.
The couple of things that I want to say are both things that are picking up on points I made in the first podcast but didn't get out properly.
Okay.
I hadn't worked out properly.
So let's begin with you then.
Well, the first thing was I talked about the film having... I said kind of, I think generally, the film feels, quote unquote, the most comic booky that I think Marvel has felt. And I didn't really know how to express it other than if they felt like a freedom or a lightness to it. And what I kind of think I've realised is that it's to do with a kind of lack of taking itself seriously. I say lack, that kind of makes it sound like a bad thing. But what I mean is, like, when you think back to Infinity War, part of the reason that I was so sucked in by that movie and kind of believed in the ending and everything was that it was so dramatic and took itself so seriously, and was and kind of making these big overtures to ending and the kind of size of the task and all that sort of thing. And when I said, like, part of the attraction of Endgame was I want to see how they get out of it. What's the game of how they get out of it. And when you think about how they do that, it's incredibly kind of skipped over. Really, it's we invented time travel. Like Scott.
And we ignore all the rules that have ever been used for.
Well, no, they don't ignore them. They say we're not going to do Back to the Future, and then they do Back to the Future too. But it's like, but they just invent it. You have this thing with Iron Man. They go to see Iron Man at his cottage with his family, and he says, "No, I'm not interested." And then secretly, he basically puts in his computer and says, "Siri, how do I do time travel?" And Siri works it out for him. And he goes, "Now I've got this wrist GPS time travel thing. We can do time travel." Like, it is that easy in the film. You know what I mean? It's not that, like, the challenge is not how are we going to do this. It's what are we going to do once we're using it.
I think the reason why I had reservations about you using, comic book in that sense is, that there is an argument to be made for certain runs of comic books by certain artists and writers that are really great art, that did take themselves very seriously and that did deal with complex issues. So I think we have to use another term to.
That's probably not the right term. I agree. Like, because I know what you're talking about. You're talking about things like Killing Joke, like Alan Moore and things like
also,
that, and Frank Miller.
The Frank Miller, the Elektra series. I mean, kind of those are things that kind of,
I
still resonate.
That. So, like, that's not quite the right term. But in terms of the sort of the lightness of being able to go and now everything's fixed and we can just move straight on. Like, it doesn't carry on from the level of seriousness that I think the entire series of Marvel films has been trying to approach or use or generate, whatever. Like, the challenges that this film faces in that respect, it just goes, now we can go through time. Feels like in another film there would have been. It feels like there could be 5 hours.
For me, that's the least of its problems.
Sure.
That narrative agility of being able to do things with a kind of ease. I mean, you see that in all kinds of fantasy kind of texts. It's hardly unusual.
But when I said that, like, Captain Marvel in this film, I found her a kind of bait and switch because I felt like I'd been led to believe she would be more important than she was.
Uh-huh.
I feel in a similar way about the complexity of the solution to the problem that Infinity War set up of how do we get these people back. It just kind of goes, and now we can do it.
Yes.
See what I mean?
I do see what you mean.
That felt like a little bit of a letdown in a way, because that was part of the attraction for me.
Well, for me, there are two things in terms of it being a letdown, and in terms of what we ended up discussing. That our closing statement of, but it's not art. So, one of the things that really caught my eye was how, the film is discussed in the New York Times and also by Matt Solar-Seitz. He's saying, well, this is the end of kind of, this is no longer kind of cinema. It's just basically content, right? Which I think is interesting. And one of the things that was discussed by the New York Times Roundtable is, how it's not cinema, right? So again, it's kind of, or it's not cinematic. I forget what expression they used, right? How, it's basically kind of a type of storytelling, but that focuses on kind of narrative, that is not very visual, that it doesn't really kind of symbolize or use kind of a lot of metaphor. And I think, well, this is interesting because it's true, really.
The A.O. Scott refers to the series as a monument to adequacy. And he talks about in the Harry Potter series, people who are into films and critics talk about Prisoner of Azkaban being the best Harry Potter film, the one that was directed by Alfonso Cuarón.
Yes.
But Harry Potter fans tend to dislike it the most.
Yes.
It's the one that kind of least reflects what they think of the series and that sort of thing.
Yes.
So there's this kind of mismatch between the cinema and the stories they're based on.
That's right. So, the things that we were talking about, or, kind of films that are interesting, I mean, they're often odd or quirky or weird or surrealistic or symbolic, or they have kind of a shot or an image or something that kind of disturbs or lingers in your mind or makes you think about something, right? And actually kind of the argument is that these films are all about the elimination of all of that, right? Yeah, anything that's kind of disturbing, troubling, that, kind of, it's all kind of streamlined into mass acceptability by fans. Yeah, it's kind of, so that kind of this catering to fans and pleasing fans. Yeah, it's almost kind of like, the opposite of what kind of, film art is. I mean, in the sense of commercial cinema, in a way, has always been about kind of getting an audience, right? But there are many ways of kind of getting an audience. And kind of the argument seems to be that, this whole series, kind of part of the reason why it's successful is because it streamlines everything. But on the other hand, the way that it kind of streamlines things, so kind of, if part of our argument was, and you were, kind of very interesting on this, because I kept saying, well, but it's interesting visually, and you kept saying, well, I don't think so, and then kind of we talked about, kind of what we meant by that. And I think kind of, I think you're right, but what the New York Times article made me think about, and again, I said it's something that I've been thinking about very much. I especially thought so when I watched, Beyonce's number in the Super Bowl at the midterm.
You brought this up before, Beyonce.
Yeah, where like every dance move was just militaristic, right? And actually, I thought that was almost like Leni Riefenstahl. It was speaking things about the culture, that the culture itself might be unaware of, but that nonetheless is there, right? So, to have like these armies of people kind of dancing in these very aggressive, militaristic movements, right? That they were all doing them at the same time. It was pretty much like a kind of a totalitarian regime's idea of, a stadium show, right? Like, it's the kind of thing that you see with tanks and flags and that make images in communist countries. There was that kind of rigidity and precision and so on. And actually, I think you see that in these Avengers films. It's true, I think, that they are all about war, that they have undertows of authoritarianism, right? So, often somebody like, Captain America will question authority, right? But everything is about kind of bringing it back once more, right? So I think the films do have a kind of, they're all about war. They're always about kind of battle. They're always about managing resources through the ability to manage particular types of training, and particular types of power, right? So, well, Ant-Man, Black Widow, right? But kind of, they're all brought to bear on the battle sequences in a way that is organized. So I think there's a lot of things to be questioned, right? So, I mean, there is almost like this kind of, on the one hand, there's a dismissiveness of it, which is kind of very typical of the popular, right? So
the dismissiveness of the films.
Of the films.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, there's a real dismissiveness of Marvel films. I mean, whether you like it or not, they are the most significant mode of cinema of the last 10 years. One of the arguments is they've actually radically altered what commercial cinema is and can be at the moment, right? But you have a whole sector of the population that, dismisses them entirely. And then you have another sector of the population that kind of worships them uncritically.
Yeah, likes them and nothing but.
That these are the only types of films that they go see.
Were those people that you said, you mentioned a couple of guys sitting next to you saying, do you really think this is going to be the best film ever?
Well,
did they really say that?
They did, yes.
That's madness.
So there are almost like those two poles. I'm sure there's stuff in between, but those two poles kind of really exist. And maybe what there isn't enough of is, accepting these films on their own terms, but nonetheless kind of, applying or making a critique of them, on the grounds that kind of on the very same basis, that all of the things that are important, all the cultural artifacts or experiences of culture are kind of analyzed through. And I think, the idea that these films are militaristic, that they are about war, that actually they do tell us something about America at this moment, kind of, in spite of all of the celebrations of the Black Panther, he's but like, what, 100% of the representations of the superheroes. I don't know how many superheroes we now get in the Marvel films, right?
Loads.
But yeah, there's been 22.
Literally loads.
There's been 22 films, and there's probably like 100 superheroes or 50 or whatever. There's one black superhero, right? In the whole of the Marvel universe, kind of, there are many token female superheroes, but really, there's only been one that has had her own film. Right.
There was a good point, a really interesting point that someone made in the New York Times article about Black Panther, the film in particular, and talking about Killmonger, the villain in that, because we were really impressed, I think, by how he died. Basically, he dies saying, die on your feet rather than live on your knees.
Yes.
I can't go on living if I choose to die. Basically.
Yes.
And that was a really powerful kind of statement to put in this film, and I still agree with that. But what they're saying in the article is like, but he still dies, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, Wakanda is able to assimilate kind of his political perspective into itself as it goes on. Yeah. They talk about Oakland, where Killmonger comes from, becoming a kind of protectorate of Wakanda at the end, which is an interesting way of looking at it. And they talk about the tech billionaire superiority of these films, with Wakanda being this kind of tech sort of Silicon Valley, and obviously Iron Man is this kind of tech or also weapons manufacturer billionaire who kind of starts the whole thing off in 2008. And I thought that was an interesting, like, it's not just the case that Killmonger sort of, Killmonger gets his point out, and you have people going, Killmonger was right, and I agree with him, and so on. But he still dies, and he's defeated, and his point kind of is assimilated or dissipated.
Yes.
The film, the kind of the world gets to carry on being militaristic and.
Yes. Well, the argument that I was making also about all these heroes being kind of Aryan, which I suppose, and it's only kind of later that I ticked about. Why were you objecting to Aryan when I meant kind of Northern European? I now get the distinction very clearly. So, but that's still something, right?
Yes.
Like, why why are they visualized that way? I mean, yeah, it is a kind of racism. And the films do kind of exhibit a kind of sexism. I mean, it's basically like Ideology 101. It was very interesting that shot we mentioned of all the women kind of being put together in one shot, you know, is also something that's being really discussed, you know. And it's kind of discussed both as something that is completely tokenistic, you know, and then one of the people in the round table said, oh, you know, but it still kind of got me excited. And then the argument can be, well, isn't it pathetic, you know, that we're being excited, that we're getting excited by this completely tokenistic gesture, right, which occupies so little of the film, and which actually in some ways kind of underlines, you know, how sexist the whole project is. And now, you know, there's a difference between kind of, you know, being actively misogynist, right, and kind of, you know, depicting women in hateful ways, or, you know, this other kind of sexism, which is kind of structural, but it also has to do with mindfulness, with not paying attention, you know, with kind of asserting one's own preferences, and with marginalizing and excluding, right? And you can argue that, you know, the sexism evident in the Marvel films, you know, might not be a deliberate one, but that doesn't mean that it's not there, or it's not as evidently there. And that kind of shot just absolutely underlines that.
Yeah, it's because there is one way of looking at it, which is that the films have been set up in this very white, masculine world and were for years and years, and it's only in recent years that kind of social pressure has got Marvel to go, okay, well, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, like, would start doing something a little bit different. But then on the other hand, kind of when it comes to the giant centerpiece movie, which is Endgame, those characters are once again relegated to being the very Martins. Tiniest part, you know.
And actually, Marvel has no excuse, because, you know, I remember reading, you know, the comic books in the early 70s, and they were all full of black power and, you know, kind of... So actually, they know all of the arguments about race, right? But actually, kind of, you know, in their cinematic franchises, they might know the arguments, and they might know what to do, but they haven't done it, which makes it worse, right? So they can't even kind of beg... ignorance, or you know, they have no excuse, because if you look at those comic books, all of the arguments are there in the 70s. You know, I mean, it's been going for 10 years, and the idea that the Ms. Marvel film came out last year, you know, was a success, is seen as being something extraordinary, or as a groundbreaker, or as something that opens new ground. And you think, like, really, that's where we're at the moment, you know? So I think the films are open to all of those kinds of criticisms, and, you know, and I think actually, if you analyze the film those ways, they really speak of an ugliness in the culture. You know, the fact that, you know, they're quite dystopic, but they're dystopic in things, or their idea of dystopia, or the context for the dystopia is as a battle, you know, through which might alone is the only factor.
Yeah, I was thinking back on that final giant battle in Endgame, because really the whole film is one battle, really. They talk about this in the article. Kind of the rest of the film is building up to it, but actually there's only one big fight, which is that final one. And in that fight, this goes to the other point that I wanted to make, which is comparative to everything you've been talking about. It's really minor, because it's just about the story. But it's about when I said that Thanos was kind of rubbish. What I think I meant, what I've realised is that because this is an alternate reality Thanos, he doesn't know anyone, right? Like he basically shows up and has a fight with them, but this is a Thanos who doesn't know these people. And there's one line of dialogue where he says, I think it's the Scarlet Witch, he says, "I don't even know who you are," and it kind of feels pointing that up, and it kind of makes him just make very little sense. He's just a big angry dude who wants to add to these stones, but it doesn't make much sense. Like he's seen Nebula's recordings, so he kind of knows what's going on. But it's basically like he's been cramming, like revising, like who I should hate and all who these people are. So that kind of doesn't make sense. But then there's that one moment with Scarlet Witch where she kind of lands in front of him, and this is when he says, "I don't know who you are," and I think she says, "You will," or something like that. And I kind of thought that might then go to sort of, she would use her, because she's got these mind powers. She's supposed to be the most powerful one, I think. She has these kind of mind powers, and I thought that she would maybe like get into his mind and show him the kind of destruction that he's wrought, and all the stuff from the start of the movie where everyone is in pain of all the people that they've lost and so on Earth, the destruction of the place. Like that would like to kind of tell him who he is and what he's done and all that sort of thing. Actually, what happens is they punch each other, basically. But like it's that's a huge kind of. That was another huge letdown, I think.
Yes.
And I kind of.
I think also, for me, one of the things that has always bothered me about these films is, the way that people are killed left and right, as if it's of no consequence. And actually, not just people, but also the fact that you can raise entire cities and it doesn't matter, right? And of course, that speaks of an attitude, really. Yeah, where kind of, the property of others doesn't matter, but also kind of people don't matter and people's lives don't matter. It all becomes collateral damage. So long as it doesn't affect you, it's collateral damage, right? And I think the films very much take that attitude,
Yeah. Or if it's for a quote unquote greater good, New York was completely destroyed in 2012.
Yes.
But they managed to stop Loki and they got the thing and.
I know, but they stopped Loki, but that is like collateral damage. That is something that you would expect the U.S. State Department to say, right? Okay, so, 100,000 civilians died and 1,000 U.S. soldiers died, but we won the battle of whatever and we took over the strategic country of whatever, right? That's exactly that kind of militaristic mindset.
But then that leads to a kind of thing where, again, this is something that they talked about in the article, where... They talked about a subplot from Avengers, the one that had the New York fight, that was cut, which was going to follow a waitress as she kind of navigated the sort of fight that was going on around her and give a kind of perspective of an ordinary person caught up in this war, and then they go on to say you end up with these fights that because people started to pick up on this, they primarily I think picked up on it with Man of Steel, the DC film, where it was Superman and whoever his enemy was flying through buildings and exploding, and it was just the two of them exploding all of New, and it was insane. And then people started going okay, what is the casualty? What is the sort of cost of lives in this? And that's when film started to go. Let's make sure in dialogue we say this building is empty. We've established that it's empty, and let's have these fights in Wakanda, for instance. The huge fight in Infinity War. They're in fields, or forests. There's no one there, and one of the critics talks about the fatal snap that Thanos does that destroys half the universe, is done in the middle of a forest somewhere, and it's complete. It would have been a more interesting shot had it been somewhere with stakes and something like that. But they basically remove all these battles to places where civilians can't get hurt any longer.
Well,
which on the other, which has a separate. On the one hand, people aren't getting hurt. On the other hand, they make them really, really. They lose a lot of interest doing that.
Well,
in places where there aren't so many stakes.
I mean, you did see a lot of damage of buildings and and people and so on in Endgame. Anyway.
Well, yeah, because half of civilians have been wiped out. And then planes will crash and all this sort of stuff. So you see the destruction of the world that has resulted. Although I thought it was a bit weird that there was still, ongoing sort of mobile phone coverage and stuff.
Well, you see, the arguments that you're making are very interesting because I think so much of the discussion of this film has really focused on plot. And actually, in that sense, the comparison of Game of Thrones to this film...
No spoilers.
...is very similar. Right, all of the discussions have been about plot.
Yeah,
about how the plot resolves itself. Yeah, and kind of very little about kind of meaning or feeling or it's all about kind of how the plot ties together. Really, not just in this film but through the whole of the series and how it brings in the different strands and so on. Yeah, but. Yeah, so in that sense... That
was part of my realisation that this is soap opera as well, which I hadn't quite figured out. Like I said, that was part of my realisation that in soap opera, everything is about the plot. It's about what's going to happen next, and don't spoil anything.
It's very different than soap opera, though. And I think, there was the New Yorker ran a really interesting article, talking about narrative and these Marvel Universe films. And they're very insistent that, on the one hand, the New York Times says, these films have a sitcom kind of view of the world in the sense that it's all about, people, very different types of people learning how to get along with each other, right? That's the Avengers.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the type of storytelling that they have is not like a soap opera, right? Because a soap opera is constant cliffhangers and plot. But actually, it doesn't have that element of, oh, do you remember what happened in 1972 when Hilda Ogden, blah, 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 and then kind of, how this connects with that and that connects with that.
It has a little bit. I mean, this film, the centre of this film is built on going back to previous films where they know they've figured out where the stones are.
I think the films are all about that.
Okay, all right.
Right? And kind of bringing in all of these different strands, actually. And I think the discussion of Game of Thrones has all been about, kind of bringing in all of the different plots of all of the different years and how they ultimately connect in this last one.
Okay.
Right. I think that's not what soap operas do.
Oh, right, okay.
I mean, you might remember, so for example, they will often bring back a character, and, there are certainly very famous episodes that people remember and that are referred back to.
Yeah.
But there's not this sense of keeping all of the strands of the 40 years or 50 years of Coronation Street in your head, right? Like, as something is unfolding,
That's true.
So that type of narrative storytelling, I think, is something that Game of Thrones has very much in common with Avengers Endgame.
Sure.
Okay. And that is different, so the argument was, maybe more people saw Dallas and the famous Who Killed JR episode, than are seeing, like, Game of Thrones. But, this idea that kind of, you're putting all of the elements of the 7 seasons kind of together in that play in this finale. No, the episode of Dallas didn't ask you to do that. Right?
No, sure.
So it's
well, I'm not talking about Game of Thrones, I'm talking about Avengers.
No, but
no, I do get what you mean. There's more complexity to the storytelling, and it's less about just moving on and keeping on going to the next bit.
So, I mean,
to me, the central commonality I'm thinking about when I talk about soap opera is the idea that plot is king. In that, I mean, you should see people going on about spoilers. Like, I mean, obviously, you don't want to spoil it, but like any tiny thing can be a spoiler, and if you know something that happens, it makes everything worthless.
But that's why the arguments about this not being cinema or being the end of cinema or just being content or it being a Disneyfication of cinema, this is why they're all so interesting, actually, because there are very few films in which plot was the central element. I mean, in fact, film-going practices often were that you could pop in at a film at any time of day.
Yeah.
Right? And kind of, and you watch the end and then you'd watch the beginning. Right? So beginnings and endings were important. But, the films weren't about plot. Right? Whereas actually so much of the discussion about Endgame, like with Game of Thrones, seem to be plot-driven.
No, I agree with that. I just think we are making slightly different points though, because you're talking about the complexity of the plot and building in stuff and remember from the various things that have been built into the story for years and years.
I am talking about partly that.
What I'm talking about is the idea that if you know something, it all of a sudden becomes completely unimportant. Like everything, the reason that you're there, and I think the reason I was there, is to see what happens next. It's not about how it happens, or to whom it happens, or what the characters, this and that. It's about, literally, I need to know how the plot goes. And I think that is what it has hugely in common with soap opera.
Well, that is what it has been reduced to, and so these arguments are then very interesting. And I'm not even sure that that's true, because, like me, I'm sure you will often, if Avengers is on television, you've seen it and you watch it all over again, and it won't be because of plot.
There are other pleasures. That's absolutely certain, and I've watched a number of the Marvel films a second time. But the initial pleasure, I think, and the reason that people are so kind of aggressive about keeping spoilers away from them, so not looking at Facebook and stuff, just in case someone says something, is because that and I'm like this a little bit with most stuff. Like, I don't like things to be spoiled, but it's been ramped up so much with this, and I think with Game of Thrones as well.
Well, I think with Game of Thrones,
like with EastEnders, when there was that famous Christmas, like, you ain't my mother. If you'd known that twist was coming, it would have ruined it.
Okay, but I think that's because well, for me, those things are very much about plot. Actually, I think Game of Thrones is so much about plot that I thought I'd watch. Because you've been rewatching, and I thought, just
not rewatching. I'm only up to season 4.5. So don't tell me anything that happens after season 4.5.
I won't say anything after season 4.5. But I thought, I'll rewatch one of the years, and actually I just couldn't be bothered to.
Yeah.
You know, like it just seemed too much of an investment. And I think it really is about plot, and you feel, well, you know the plot, you know, and there's not much else to get from it really. Or anyway, that's the way I felt. So I think it's interesting if one conceives of, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe about, you know, kind of a type, a mode of filmmaking in which kind of plot once again kind of reasserts a dominance over what, you know, a cinema going experience is.
And I think it kind of leads to a kind of stupidity in the people watching it, myself included. Like when you're watching it just for plot, I think this is the case with things like Star Wars as well. You know, like how
Star Wars is there. You know,
I have to know what happens next, and I won't. I know it's bored for me, but then that becomes the only reason that I'm there. And as I say, like there are other pleasures to these things. There are reasons that you go back and watch these films a second time once you know what happens. It's not the only pleasure; it's just protecting the plot from yourself.
I love the first 3 Star Wars films for many reasons, you know. But even in my most deluded state, I would never make an argument for any of them as art, you know, kind of. So and I think very much. You know, I think if we agree that the Marvel films are the dominant kind of mode of filmmaking, you know, at the moment, and you know, if they don't aspire to art and if they don't work as art, and I would argue that they don't really, you know, for me, I mean, we were talking the other day about, you know, going to see Happy as Lazarus, and we've had a few experiences like that.
Happy as Lazaro.
Seeing Phantom Thread, you know, there are so many films that they just linger. They're like a worm in your mind, you know, and kind of, you know, and you feel like watching and rewatching them, and it's a way of working things through in your own life or in your attitude to life, you know. And actually, there's no way. I mean, let me tell you, if you're working your life through kind of these films, you have a problem.
Yeah, take heed, nerds.
Yes, Mike.
What are you talking about? These films aren't what I'm obsessed with. I know I can get into them, but like what I'm obsessed with is avoiding spoilers for the Liverpool versus Barcelona first leg of the semi-final tonight. Because I'm going to miss that because we're seeing the Stuart Lee thing, and if I have that spoiled for me before I get to watch the game,
you'll kill someone.
I will. I'll go mental. You know.
Anyway,
so I am a spoiler. I am a spoiler twat.
There were a couple of other things that I thought,
because football is just another soap opera. You know, we just build our narratives and just I want to know what happens next.
I think football is different, but you know that's a discussion for.
Well, I showed you that Spurs versus Man City game, and it was all about you don't know how mad it's going to be, and when it was, you were like, blah, blah, blah.
Well, that's true.
Someone had told you it was 2-2 after 10 minutes.
No, but there's other elements at play in football, you know, and I think it's another discussion. I mean, just watching the way that those kids move in the field is like awesome, you know. It's like a gift of God or something. It's like watching great dance and the teamwork and there's all other kinds of things actually at play there. So the other things that I wanted to bring up about the Marvel Cinematic Universe was, you know, this idea that there are no stars, that the characters subsume the stars, right? Yes. And that is also something actually, you know, significant about the time that we're living in. So, you know, if both Game of Thrones and Avengers Endgame are just content, right? And they're content actually for different distribution and exhibition mechanisms. If what's important is you know, a brand, then, and also if Hollywood is also not making films, you know, in which a star persona is a significant carrier for it, then actually what happens is that the figure of America, you know, or the figure of Iron Man or the figure of Aquaman is actually kind of much more of a brand and much more of a signifier of a whole set of values, you know, than what an individual actor or even star might be able to contribute. And I thought that was interesting and maybe part of the same kind of forces in play, right? That along with, you know, the Marvel Cinematic Universe becoming the dominant mode of cinema, that has gone alongside the lack of films being made for a mainstream adult audience. You know, the kinds of films that Michael Douglas would do, right? That were often like very big box office successes, right? I mean, I think in another article by Martin Zoller Seitz,
Matt Zoller Seitz,
you know, he was saying, oh my God, it's unbelievable that, you know, The War of the Roses, you know, was a film that was made for 25 million and it grossed 320 million, right? And it really is about, you know, Kathleen Turner and Michael Douglas practically killing each other over a divorce, right? You know, so it's like this kind of black comedy, right? But it was like a massive...
Was that the one that you talked about? Was that the Danny DeVito, or was that something else?
Danny DeVito directed it.
Yes, you've mentioned it before. I've not seen it yet.
Well, you know, that was like a huge box office success. That kind of film is unimaginable. You would not be able to make that film now. I mean, you know, who's going to go see a film, you know, in a cinema about a divorce, right? Kind of whether it has stars or not. Yeah, like, you know, you might get an art film, a little art film made about that, but not kind of a mainstream big star vehicle, you know, made on a reasonable budget. Yeah, but for an adult audience. So
yeah, everything's becoming exaggerated. Like, they do talk in the article about, like, they don't make the films anymore where the actors like Chris Hemsworth and the Chris Evanses in this kind of would go and do to sort of what someone says. Do people want to see Chris Evans do something that isn't Captain America? I don't know, and the movies will probably never let us find out, because they don't make the kinds of things anymore that let people like Chris Hemsworth and Chris Evans, and even to some extent Chris Pratt, do more than movie star karaoke. You know, the kind of small
movie star karaoke. Yeah. It's a really interesting thing. So they're not themselves, you know, kind of the originators of a performance. They're just kind of, you know, giving a voice track or giving an outside track to something that is already kind of pre-made, pre-digested. The beats and the rhythms have already been set, right? And all they do is they embody that moment for a brief little while, but they themselves are not essential to it.
It was Wesley Morris who made that point.
That's a wonderful line.
And then they go on to make the point. Then this was quite an interesting one, that Bradley Cooper is the kind of biggest genius of all the actors in this, because he plays Rocket, the raccoon, and it's a really good performance, and he's got loads of personality and stuff. But But Bradley Cooper is not walking down the street, people going, "You're Rocket from," you know, whereas everyone else is going, "You're Captain America."
Yes.
You know.
No, and then
maybe the other one is Iron Man, Robert Downey Jr. I should say. Yes, because he's the one who started it, so he gets the credit.
Well, yeah, which I think, you know, I think people are going overboard in their praise for him. Myself, you know, he himself, you know, the only success in all the time that he's been doing Iron Man, the only success he's had has been as Sherlock Holmes. So, you know, he's basically played two pre-established characters.
Yeah. So, no, I wasn't saying that. But as Marvel goes, like, he was the one who kicked it off. Well, I mean, and there's an argument to be made. There's a similar argument to be made about Pirates of the Caribbean and Johnny Depp, and how, you know, would that franchise be what it is without him? Would Marvel be what it is without him?
Well, that's true. That's true. I mean, I think it's certainly true of Johnny Depp. I mean, the films would have been nothing without him. You know, I think the Marvel things will be interesting, because, you know, what I foresee is, you know, what happened with Superman, that every generation or so, or Spider-Man, you know, you'll get a different actor playing the character, but really what's important is the leotard, not the actor. You know, I mean, an actor can make it better or can make it worse, but actually they're no longer essential to...
Do you think there's a case, in the case of Iron Man particularly, where basically if you don't come from comic books and you weren't reading them, you will know Batman and you will know Superman, you'll know Spider-Man, you'll know the very biggest characters even if you've never read a comic book in your life.
Yes.
But Iron Man I'd never heard of. And the idea that you could come in and put your own personality on him and make him your character for people who didn't know him, and there wasn't an expectation that people should. You know, like if Marvel had started off with The Incredible Hulk, for instance, like that was their first movie, I think there would have been a more pressure because I think people know the character more widely and they have more expectation of him. Whereas Iron Man, you go, I don't know who this is. It was kind of small.
What year did the Fantastic Four come out?
I don't know.
Well, because I think it probably came around the time of Iron Man, and that is a Marvel series, and it bombed, right? And partly it bombed because, well, it was a very poor film, and some of the acting was very bland,
Fantastic
right?
Four, 2005, and there was a sequel in 2007.
Okay, so, and when did the first Iron Man come out?
2008.
Okay, so you see, Fantastic Four was, like, those are Marvel characters before Iron Man. You know?
Yeah. But do you think that? But then, as you say, the film was sucked for one thing.
Well,
but is there a thing of the expectation that is high because people know those characters?
No, what I'm trying to make an argument here is that Robert Downey Jr. did, in fact, imbue the character with charisma and emotion and so on in a way that Reese, whatever his name is, the Welsh actor, didn't do with Mr. Fantastic.
I've no idea.
Look up who the stars were. Chris Evans is the only one that's really memorable.
Chris Evans was in it. Yes.
Yeah.
Ewan Griffith.
Yes, him.
Ewan Griffith.
Right. He came across as like a piece of wood, and also the lead actress, whom I like very much, she's really, really pretty, but she's also really bland.
Jessica Alba.
Yeah. Right. So kind of. I mean, give Downey credit where it's due, but not as much as he's been receiving.
Gritted teeth. But I think there's also maybe just a slightly sort of tactical element where you go, let's start off with a character. Let's lower expectations at the start. If we start off with Spider-Man, well, I mean they couldn't because Sony owned Spider-Man, but if we start off with the Incredible Hulk, say, and we fuck it up, then we've kind of fucked it up forever. Whereas you can recover. I mean, Iron Man was great, but then they had Thor, and Thor sucked. But you can recover from Thor, as they did.
Yes. I mean, I don't know. Again, and I'm showing my age, but kind of, I remember the Spider-Man TV series. There was a Captain America TV series. There was a Hulk television series, right? And they were all hits, right? And they were all primetime hits. So actually, probably just as many Americans saw those things on TV, if not more, on a weekly basis than have seen these films. But I think kind of what is something to reflect on is, the effect that these films have had on cinema. Yeah, I mean, it is the dominant mode of cinema. People will only go out to the cinema to see films like this or of this type, and very little else. Which in many ways is great for TV, right? Like, kind of, there are other things, that TV has taken on and is doing much better. But on the other hand, kind of something that used to be called cinema does seem to be not easily visible on screens in either. You see, my fear is something like Happy as Lazzaro is not playing at Cineworld, right? And actually, I don't think watching it on television will be as powerful. I just don't think so.
No.
I mean, kind of seeing those, the innocence of Lazzaro on a huge screen, those eyes, and just, that angelic look, and being kind of overwhelmed by it. Yeah, it's like the head is so much bigger than yours. It's almost like it's acting on you physically, right? And you're certainly kind of looking at it and contemplating it, and like it is just a different viewing experience. And so if and that's that to me, and certainly until now, has been a type of cinema. And if that's lost, I do think that kind of something important is being lost. That kind of, this change or the shift into the audio visual, right, is not without a cost.
I think it's not lost, but it's being misplaced. You have to look harder to find it.
Well, that's true, but then all other kinds of things are being lost because cinema was the great popular art form of the last century. So, I mean, what we're now saying is that cinema has become a kind of a middle class, aesthetic activity, for the bourgeois, for people who can afford it.
As it always should be. Keep the riff-raff
and
out.
the rest of the peasants just get Avengers Endgame. Anyway, something to think about.
Yes, it's all something to think about, isn't it? It is kind of... It's just a marker of kind of what it is, that once you've seen it, it just... Okay, I've seen it now. Like when you consider the build-up and it has all been leading to something, you go, oh, it's over now.
I think the only because I have seen all 22 of the Marvel films.
So have I.
And I think the only one that I felt, oh my god, this is so interesting, I'd like to see it again, and I haven't quite, not resolved it, because you never really resolve films, but, come to a deeper understanding of some elements in the film, is Black Panther for me.
Well, it's clearly the best one that they've made, and there's a very good reason it got a Best Picture nomination. Like, that wasn't for nothing. And there have been interesting things kind of sprinkled throughout all of their films.
Yes,
I mean, yeah.
I've kind of enjoyed. I think I've enjoyed them all to different degrees. I mean, some have been very poor, but I've still enjoyed them. I mean, kind of Venom was poor and so much fun, though I've seen it again on
not
television.
MCU, to be fair.
Oh, I thought Venom was a Marvel.
No, he's a Marvel character, but because Sony bought Spider-Man years ago, he's part of that.
Oh, right, okay.
So the reason that Spider-Man's in these is because Sony basically says, yes, you can. You can use your own character.
Fine.
Yeah. So Venom is separate.
Okay. So, anyway, nonetheless, like, some of the Thor films have been very poor, and yet I've liked them, and I've liked certain things about them and whatever. But...
I'd say the same about Guardians of the Galaxy, which I still really don't like, but...
I really like it.
I watched the first one a second time when I watched the whole lot when I think we were doing Infinity War, and I found things to like in it.
I love it. But, and I think in different ways that than Black. I mean, it doesn't compare to Black Panther really.
No.
So putting a damper on the works here. Though I still think Endgame was great fun. Actually, I don't refute any of the things that we said.
No.
Earlier in the podcast. But I think a kind of and I'm just kind of thinking aloud, and I haven't worked any of these things through, But these things about that there was little cinematic in the film. That these types of films have become just content, that, Disney has not just captured all of the children, but actually the adult audience as well at the moment, that there's a whole set of ideological moves in these films that are actually very coercive, and that speak of a certain kind of a militaristic, authoritarian culture. I think those are all things to explore. I think they are there.
So endeth the lesson. We need to get going.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies. We have that bit, don't we?
Well, yeah. We'll add it on to the end of this because it'll be a mammoth 2-hour podcast. Yeah. Go on.
Okay. Well, that's it. We are eavesdropping at the movies.
We're on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Twitter and Facebook. And the website is eavesdroppingatmovies.com. We probably won't do another epic podcast in the future, but you never know.
Yes.
Didn't expect this one to go as long as we have.
We welcome hate mail. Do send it.
All right. Then. Bye-bye.